Hello, and welcome to the Evelyn Y. Davis studios at the National Press Foundation. Today we're talking about tariffs, agriculture, the Farm Bill, and how they might play out in the midterm elections.
The National Press Foundation is a nonprofit dedicated to helping journalists cover complex topics with depth and accuracy. We serve journalists in the U.S. and around the world.
I'm Sandy Johnson, president of the National Press Foundation. With me in the studio today is Alan Bjerga, agriculture reporter for Bloomberg News. Our topic today is tariffs, trade, the Farm Bill, and midterm elections. So, Alan, welcome. Let's describe the state of play in the ag industry today.
So, when you're looking at agriculture, you're looking at one of the few sectors of the U.S. economy that has a trade surplus. And agriculture is coming off of a period of really record prosperity, but that is fading further into the rearview mirror every year. Farm profits are down almost half of where they were in the record year of 2013. You saw a big decline from 2013 to 2016. Things have stabilized somewhat since then, but one of the few things that continue to buoy the agriculture economy is trade. The U.S. is the world's largest exporter of food goods, especially your grains and your oil seeds, corn, wheat, soybeans, but also a lot of specialty products. Pretty much all of the world's almonds are exported from the United States. And so you see both a farm economy that has cooled off significantly from some fairly recent heights, but one that has been very much held up by the strength of trade and the strength of the United States as an agricultural exporter. So those factors, of course, because of recent developments with the tariff wars, the trade war, as well as agriculture and farm voters, part of what's perceived as President Trump's political debate, that suddenly made agriculture a much more interesting political story than what you may traditionally see.
Mm-hmm. So U.S. farmers are standing by Trump right now. Let's look at a story that you put together.
U.S. farmers are sticking with President Trump despite a trade war that's hurting them, but they'd like it resolved by harvest. I'm Alan Bjerga, and I cover agriculture for Bloomberg News in Washington. U.S. trade disputes with China, Canada, and Mexico are harming the bottom lines in U.S. agriculture. Farmer profits already forecast at a 12-year low may plunge further as the U.S., the world's biggest agricultural exporter, feels the effects of tariffs that will lower sales. Chinese duties alone may cost U.S. soybean farmers $3.2 billion in the next year, and producers of everything from pork to almonds are suffering lost revenues. That doesn't mean farmers won't stick by the president. Soybean farmer John King of Arkansas, like other producers, are taking a wait-and-see approach, saying they appreciate tough talk on trade, but are worried about what might happen when this year's harvest comes in and they have to sell supplies at a lower price, right around the time of this year's congressional elections. Support for the White House is falling in rural America, and the president has farmers on his mind, saying in a tweet that even when he's overseas, he's thinking about their interests. What actions result from those thoughts, and how farmers who are now staying behind the president reacts to them, will go a long way toward determining who controls Congress next year. I'm Alan Bjerga for Bloomberg News in Washington.
So let's go a little bit deeper into the trade surplus on ag. What percentage of food and ag commodities are exported each year?
Oh, in terms of overall crop and livestock production value, actually probably almost 2/5, just doing some of the math in my head. And for some crops, it's an incredibly important percentage. I mean, China alone was buying a third of the U.S. soybean crop. Obviously, that's changing with the trade issue. Cotton is incredibly export dependent. It really varies depending on product. A lot of people would expect the trade war to be devastating to corn, but some of the calculations that you see from the USDA say not so much. A lot of corn goes to domestic cattle feed or to ethanol production, so it's not quite as export dependent as other products. But there are some products from the U.S. That are incredibly dependent on exports. Ginseng, as far as some sort of niche products, very much something that's international. It touches different parts of agriculture in different ways, and that's one of the challenges whenever you're talking about sort of these national agriculture issues, is that these are very localized regional crops with very specific conditions around them. It's difficult to talk about one farm economy when you really have so many.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there was a new USDA report about trade that just came out, overall trade.
Yes, and this is also an interesting thing to note as we look at the current situation. You showed that piece that I did a few weeks ago, talking about President Trump and trade. Well, since then, we've already had some developments. You, of course, saw the announcement of what was going to be the $12 billion of aid from the government for agriculture. Then you had the announcement of the actual size and scope of the payments, which the first tranche, which farmers can start signing up for now, of $4.7 billion in direct aid, another $1.3 billion in indirect price support through purchases of the market from the government. Those are things that the Trump administration has done. At the same time, just last week, you had a couple reports from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that were salient towards this situation. You saw the first projection of what U.S. agricultural exports would be in the next fiscal year, in other words, a year starting October 1st. The USDA is actually projecting overall agricultural exports to increase in the next year, just slightly. But what they see is, at the same time, you have this large jump. You have this large drop in the China market, $7 billion in sales. Just for perspective, China was the #1 buyer of U.S. farm goods in 2017. In 2019, they're expected to fall to 5th place. At the same time, you do see other crops, such as wheat, such as some of your horticultural products, actually going up, so that you would see a small increase in exports. You have to remember, this is not a static situation. At the same time that you have fewer sales to China, you have things that are helping American farmers, like drought in Argentina, drought in Northern Europe, a little bit into the Black Sea region. There are some countervailing forces that are actually helping agriculture. This also plays into the U.S. farm income estimate. The piece that you showed earlier talks about how farmer profits were going to be at a 12-year low and may tumble further. Well, now the latest USDA forecast, which was made last week, shows that farm profits, while still not where they were in 2017, actually may come in slightly above 2016. Again, they're seeing this stabilization in the agriculture economy. Perhaps without China, it would even be an upswing. But it does push a little bit against this narrative that we see and that you hear so much about, the struggling farmer and trade devastating agriculture and the government needing to bail them out. There are some numbers showing that maybe things are more nuanced than that seems.
And let's talk about the Trump administration. What exactly did Trump do? And let's go really granular here. How do the tariffs affect farmers and growers?
So again, it affects different products in different ways, and that is what was shown in the Trump administration's action on the direct payments to farmers. There was that graphic that was just up a moment earlier showing that of the 4.7, more than 3.6 billion of the 4.7 goes directly to soybeans. There's another amount that's going to cotton, a certain amount that goes to pork. But if you take a look at those numbers, so those are largely, per bushel or such. You see pork and dairy also have their own combinations. But when you see for corn farmers, it would be 1 cent a bushel. For soybeans, it's $1.65 a bushel. You can imagine all of the different commodity groups in town taking a look at that and saying, wait, this trade damage that our growers are facing is being wildly estimated by the government. I mean, you've heard concerns from corn, you've heard concerns from dairy. Some people and some groups are looking at cotton, where prices have actually been going up in recent months, wondering why they're getting more than, say, corn. Sorghum, also has been affected greatly. But is a much smaller crop in production than some of these other products. So, the USDA has their formula. It isn't just pulled out of a hat. The calculations of trade damage, the econometrics on this are actually quite well established, because you need them for things like WTO cases. The economists have formulas that they can work from, and they apply a lot of these same formulas to decide, okay, what has to be paid to what to mitigate against this damage. But anytime you start picking winners and losers and putting price tags on things, there are people who are going to be upset. That's part of why farm policy in the last generation has been geared away from this type of payment situation, away from these disaster bailouts, whatever the disaster may be. But we seem to be heading back to these times, which lead to a return to some of these political thorns that agriculture had thought they had moved away from.
Well, let's talk about soybeans for a minute. Why are they represented so outsized in the the sectors of the ag industry that will be hurt more by the tariffs?
Well, because of dependence on China. I mean, 1 out of every 3 U.S. soybeans in 2016 were sent to China. It's not like corn where, say, 12% of the crop may be exported. With soybeans, it can be 40, 50% of the crop. So it's just much more trade dependent. And China is by far the dominant buyer. When you saw the USDA cut its forecast for Chinese exports from $19 billion this fiscal year to $12 billion the next year, a lot of that was felt in soybeans. Another little bit of a subtext as well, and this gets back to corn being so upset about things. A lot of people who grow soybeans grow corn as well. And so soybeans were weighted toward a lot of the payments. There was a feeling, I think, that a lot of that soybean money ends up going to corn producers anyway because they're the same people. But they're not always the same people. And people have to be looking out for their interests. And that's why you see some concern about the relative disparities in corn and soybean payments in corn country.
Now, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're the expert, there's a similar amount of corn and soybeans grown in the United States.
It depends on what your metric is. This year, actually, soybeans surpassed corn in planting in terms of overall acreage. It's the first time there were more soybean acres planted in the U.S. than corn since 1983. And even 83 has a little bit of an asterisk because that was very much motivated by some government policies of that time. This is kind of the first time the market has ever driven farmers to plant more soybeans than corn. And once again, the Chinese market was a big reason for that. In terms of overall crop production, nothing touches corn in the U.S. because the amount of corn you can get out of an acre is 3 to 4 times more than you can get for soybeans per acre. I could start getting into agronomics and like different soil conditions and stuff like that, but that may be a little bit beyond the purview of a policy discussion.
Okay, but all right, so you've explained why soybeans are affected in an outsized way. Why is corn not? Where does the corn grow in the United States go to?
Livestock or gas tanks. Corn is the dominant feedstock for animals in the United States, and so that and ethanol compete for the top 2 uses. The U.S. is still by far the world's largest corn exporter, but corn is just not exported in the same way as soybeans.
Let's talk about another commodity. Actually, you pick one: dairy or pork, for instance.
Well, pork has been affected the second most probably of any crop. Of any farm product. And once again, that's the size of the China market. Half of the world's pigs live in China. The Chinese consumer demand for pork is pretty insatiable. And so they've been hit pretty hard. Dairy is an interesting example. Dairy may be the most struggling commodity of any this time. A lot of that has to do with some overproduction that really dates back to some underproduction that was going on several years ago. But dairy, again, has not traditionally been a greatly exported product. But they do export a lot to Mexico. Mexico has been another country with whom we've had some trade difficulties. And it also underscores the increasing importance of exports to the dairy market. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, you wouldn't have even thought of them being damaged by this because it's a perishable product and is pretty much consumed domestically. But the economics in that industry is changing, and so you have dairy taking a look at this trade war, dealing with China and Mexico. Canada's kind of its own thing. In a way that you wouldn't have seen in the past.
And what is your understanding of how farmers feel about subsidies? I mean, farmers are, largely self-employed.
Yes.
They're independent, and I've heard this refrain: "Trade, not aid."
Right. And I think definitely in the farm community, trade, not aid rings very true. And a lot of the concerns that you hear in the agricultural community is, okay, great. We have a return to the bailout days. We thought we were done with bailouts, but now we're going to get a bailout. That doesn't mitigate the damage long-term to agricultural markets. And for this, we should go back to the Jimmy Carter administration. The big example that's given is the Soviet grain embargo after the invasion of Afghanistan in 1979. The U.S. stopped selling grain thinking that would hurt the Soviets. Well, Canada didn't go along, and more importantly, Brazil and Argentina didn't go along. And that is really seen as kind of the first big break that South American agriculture got. And once the South Americans were able to build these trade relationships, to a certain extent, the U.S. never got some of those relationships back. And the big concern about this is that if this lingers too far, especially into next year, other countries are going to figure out how to produce these products on their own, and they're going to be calling China, and they're going to take that market share, and the U.S. farmer will never get those markets back in the same way that they had them back when they were the ones making the sales and they were the ones that had the relationship.
So the idea for the subsidies was an offset for...
Right. It's trade mitigation, and the rationale that the USDA gave was, look, we know when you planted in 2019 that you didn't know about this trade war. I mean, I would argue that you probably would know about this trade war. We were talking about it at the time, but indeed it was not yet reality. They're using the same rationale, though, and this is interesting. There was a lot of blowback to the idea of additional farm subsidies, and you've seen a certain retrenchment in the USDA's position. First of all, this $12 billion now becoming one round of $6 billion, with the second round not being really committed to yet. It's sort of a we'll wait and see how things look before we do it. And also you've seen Secretary Perdue make statements along the lines of, we don't think that any particular aid would continue in 2019 because when farmers make their decisions on what to produce in 2019, now they know the state of play regarding trade. There will thus be less damage because of it, because farmers can make choices based on an environment that they couldn't in 2018 when none of this was a reality.
Oh, I'm going to come back to that because that's very interesting. But let's talk first about how these subsidies will work.
So there have been a lot of questions about these subsidies, and I will say being the agriculture person in a large news bureau has been a much more integrated position in recent weeks than usual, because a lot of different people and a lot of different disciplines now want to know how these things work. It's not a case of the USDA driving into a county seat with a great big boatload of cash, starting to hand them out to politically preferred farmers the day before the election. I mean, that would be a great story, but it's not necessarily true. These sign-ups, because there is a history of farm subsidies, because farm disaster programs have been pretty much a part of the agricultural landscape for some time, the actual procedures through which farmers will get a check are pretty well established in advance. I mean, a lot of these commodities are already covered under farm programs. Farmers know how to go to the FSA, Farm Service Administration offices, sign up for this program, give their yield calculations, get the payment. A lot of folks who don't think that farmers should be getting these subsidies don't like this process, but it's pretty well established. What is a little bit murkier are these market interventions that the USDA is talking about, where they're going to go into the marketplace and start buying commodities as a way to shore up the price. Again, that's not without precedent. I mean, the Barack Obama administration did the same thing in 2012 when you had a drought that was having farmers slaughtering livestock early and thus depressing prices for those commodities. But the scale of this and the number of commodities involved is such that the timing of those market purchases, the way those market purchases are going to work, that's just not quite as clear at this time, although again, it's not unprecedented.
And what is the sign-up period?
It just started. It started the day after Labor Day, and that's, you're a farmer, you go to the county office, you say, look, here's my yield, here's what my production is going to be, and then based on that, they make a calculation and they figure out what your check should be. It is a little bit challenging to be signing up right now because, the harvest season is really just beginning now. And so a lot of folks don't yet really know what their yield is. The sign-up period continues through mid-January of next year. And one thing I would caution people covering this story is, if you're contacting the USDA and you're looking for progress in signups and the USDA gives you a number and it doesn't sound like many farmers are signing up, that's not necessarily a sign that the program is, failing or succeeding or what. It just may mean that right now farmers are busy bringing in their crops and they'll get around to it around Christmas because they have till January.
Right. And when will the first checks be cut?
I mean, you're going to be trying to get that as soon as possible. The big question is whether there will be checks out before the fall elections. Probably.
Okay, let's double back to what you were saying about there probably will not continue these subsidies in 2019 because farmers can plan ahead. But as you know, farmers have leaned toward these crops that they can sell overseas because those markets are driving up the prices.
Right.
So, I mean, if you're a farmer sitting in Minnesota or Illinois, really, what do you, I mean, are you?
You know, that's an excellent point because you're bringing out something that I think is not often fully appreciated about agriculture from people who don't have any sort of acquaintance with that sort of background. You know, different crops are meant for different conditions, and they require specialized equipment and certain investments. And if you are in central Illinois, you know, God and the grain elevator have sort of foreordained that you are going to be rotating corn and soybeans. In that part of the country, there's not a heck of a lot you're going to do. I mean, what you would expect is a lot of those farmers who push soybeans to #1 acreage this year are probably going to go back to corn in an attempt to mitigate a little bit of that damage because, once again, they're minimizing their trade war exposure. You know, cotton can make a comeback in the South, but cotton is also very trade dependent. So, you know, what do you do there? You will mitigate the damage because you can make an option that may be marginally better for you in light of the trade war. But the trade war is still there. It's still affecting things, and as long as you have it, there's going to be some damage. The USDA's argument, though, is that it will be less because at least you can react and cope with it in a way that you weren't able to this year.
But if you're a soybean farmer, you're not going to suddenly turn over your acreage to ginseng or arugula. Or
No. You're not going to start growing Belgian endive or arugula or any of those other politically famous commodities. You know, yeah, you might grow corn, maybe you grow some wheat. But for example, you know, cattle production in Illinois has just, you know, it's just deteriorated over the last 30 years because so much cattle production has moved west. And all the infrastructure, you know, the sales barn, the pasture land, all of the stuff that goes with it goes away. You're not going to just suddenly take prime quality soybean land and turn it into pasture. That simply doesn't happen. And so to greater and lesser extents in different parts of the country, indeed, farmers do have their hands tied by what, you know, their soil, their buyers, and their entire infrastructure is meant to do.
So we've got a chart here about the early read on as crop prices fall, Trump's support seems to be going down too in the farm belt. Has that been, I mean, is that what you're reporting as well?
Yeah, you know, and this is a key thing to keep in mind. You know, the piece that I was doing talking about how support for Donald Trump remains strong in farm country, I will admit there was a certain corrective motivation to this. And the reason I say this, and maybe this will be talking out of school, but you see a lot of coverage. I've seen this ever since the president was elected. You know, President Trump clearly had positions on trade and, to a lesser extent, but still a strong extent, immigration, that clearly wasn't necessarily going to be what a lot of folks in farm country wanted. So there's always been this question, you know, does farm support for the president become shaky due to various policies? And every few weeks you see these articles being written, Trump support may fall in farm country because of X, it may fall because of Y. And at a certain point, you write so many of those stories, if it isn't really happening, you know, does it start to look like a wishful thinking narrative, you know, hatched by people saying, oh my gosh, when are these people going to come to their senses? And from a journalistic standpoint, that makes me uncomfortable. The fact is the president remains pretty popular among agriculture. But at the same time, it is true, and the data bears it out, some of that popularity is indeed softening. It seems like with these latest trade actions and the reality of these lower prices and the fact that while the president is tweeting about agriculture, the agriculture community is not being helped in the way that it would like to be helped. And you sort of get away from some of the regulatory issues and the tax cuts, some of the things that the president has done that have been popular in farm country as those fade further into the past. You do see some changes in terms of rural and agricultural sentiment toward the president. That said, I think it would be wishful thinking simply because of cultural conservatism, because of what some would perceive as a lack of Democratic Party alternatives, to think that there's going to be this mass desertion of farmers from the president over policies. It could be, that the president goes from 70% support to 60 or 55% support. And farmers, are not, in the end, a numerically huge portion of the American electorate. However, in various congressional districts, in certain races, in certain situations, given the need for the Democratic Party to make inroads in rural America, and given some of the mismatches between farmer priorities and administration actions, that weakening does present an opportunity for Democrats to compete in some places where they wouldn't have competed so much in the past, and thus makes, as it is in so many other issues, farmers a constituency that can really outpunch their own weight at the political level, because they are, at some level, persuadable in ways that other constituencies are not.
And what is the percentage of the American population that are farmers? And then do you also know what it is for the farm-related agriculture industries?
Sure. Well, I mean, the number of people in the United States engaged in farming is less than 2% of the population. There are about 2 million farms in the United States, and of course, there are the husbands and wives and children and all of that. As far as agriculture's contribution to the U.S. economy, it depends on your metric and what you're defining. If you include the entire food service sector, restaurants, everything that involves something that you eat or clothes that you wear, I mean, now you're getting into a double-digit sector of GDP.
Now, I'm really talking about the people that would be familiar with the impact of the tariffs and think, that their livelihood is being affected.
Sure. Farm revenues for crops and livestock this year will be about $400 billion, which is still, it's nothing to sniff at.
Excuse me. Let's segue a little bit to the Farm Bill. I know that you were at the conference committee yesterday covering it, and what is going on with the 2018 Farm Bill, which is supposed to be reauthorized by the end of September, correct? Yeah.
I wish somebody would tell me. I would go to press pretty immediately. So you had your conference committee hearing, your meeting yesterday, and the dream was that, and this is always the dream for a lot of these public conference committee meetings, is that the agreement will have been reached. The food stamp impasse will be resolved. We'll figure out what we want to do with crop insurance and commodity subsidies, and we will present it, and everyone will give a speech about how great this is. We're going to pass it by an overwhelming margin, and then we're going to send it to the floor. Well, none of that happened. What you had were a series of opening statements of people saying encouraging things and talking about the importance of agriculture and passing a farm bill, and then no real path presented forward as to how it's actually going to get done. The dirty little secret about the Farm Bill is that a lot of the urgency around it ends up being manufactured. Not that there isn't an urgency to it. On September 30th, farm programs start to expire, and while a lot of them have sort of permanent funding, mandatory funding, for all the controversy around food stamps don't go away. That's a mandatory program. A lot of your disaster programs, some research programs, some niche energy programs, their funding does stop. And now you're in the situation that you're always in when you have spending resolutions go away. You're kind of living on a wish and a prayer that your money will come back. It always does, but you don't know when and you don't know how. And actually, no, it doesn't always. That's not always the case. I should step that back. So you create a lot of uncertainty, which creates a lot of discomfort. And that said, it's not a non-routine thing to happen in farm bills. I have either covered or lived every farm bill going back to the 1970s. And I realize I'm dating myself here. But
you're just a veteran reporter.
I'm just a veteran reporter, but the actual numbers of those farm bills covered is fairly lengthy. The number lived does go back further. And, they very seldom pass on time. In 2000, 2002, we had something that was passing on time because that was the last year the CBO had a budget surplus, and it was the last year that farmers could lock in more money. Since then, you've been dealing with shrinking pies, and that's made the discussions more difficult. If you are a supporter of the food stamp program, the current debate is very disheartening for you because you're going to have to make some sort of compromise with people who want to make cuts. So,
wait, Ellen, you probably need to back up a second and explain for some of our viewers why are food stamps or the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, why are they even
in the Farm Bill?
In the Farm Bill,
right? That's a great question. Yeah. So to get outside the Beltway. So the modern Farm Bill, which basically dates to the 1970s, is sort of a forging of these two coalitions that need to get it passed. You know, once upon a time, when agriculture employed a much larger portion of the U.S. population, farm groups could kind of get their law passed on their own. As that became less common, you saw this coalition form between nutrition, food aid advocates, and the farm groups to put food stamps, food assistance, and farm subsidies in the same program. Intellectually, you can justify it because when you think about it, the food aid programs are sort of a consumption subsidy. You know, you are basically paying people to buy food, and there are studies showing that because of these programs, people spend money on food that they otherwise would have put somewhere else. So food stamps do help farmers at some level, and farmers sometimes need to be reminded of that, but it is something that is helpful to them. The farm subsidies, meanwhile, you know, there are fewer and fewer members from farming districts, especially in the House of Representatives. They are fighting for their farm programs, but it's always this coalition that gets things put through. One of the issues you've had, and it's really been the last two farm bills where nutrition assistance has become a big issue, is you have seen a certain fraying of that coalition, especially among House Republicans, where you have, you know, food stamps become the welfare state. Food stamps become government largesse to people who may not necessarily need it. And that sort of lack of sympathy in that regard has begun to trump sort of the real politic of this coalition, even among some rural Republicans who would traditionally, you would think, oh, they'll support the Farm Bill because they come from a rural district. Not necessarily the case anymore. And so that has made food stamps an increasingly controversial part of the Farm Bill. And you really saw it erupt in 2012, where you had a Farm Bill that was delayed for basically a year and a half because the House of Representatives couldn't figure out what it wanted to do on food stamps.
And one of the reasons why was that there were so many more people who turned to food stamps during the recession.
Yes, the recession saw a huge increase in the food stamp population. Part of that was the recession. Part of that was a USDA that encouraged greater percentages of eligible people to sign up. That dates back to the compassionate conservatism of George W. Bush. The Obama administration certainly continued it. You still see elevated levels of people on food stamps. We still have not reached those pre-recession levels of enrollment, and given the structure of the program now, it's possible that we never will. And we can talk all day about the implications of a country where you have the lowest unemployment in 18 years and 1 out of every 8 Americans using food stamps. But that's sort of a larger societal question. As far as the program, you have a lot of concerns from Republicans that, look, this economy is booming. Why are 1 out of 8 Americans on food stamps? They shouldn't all need to be on food stamps. Let's try to get them to work. You know, you see this shift toward job training in the House Farm Bill. Democrats will say, look, these programs are going to be inefficient. They're not going to get people to work, and in the meanwhile, you're going to be depriving needy people of benefits. They're very much at loggerheads right now. This doesn't happen so much in the Senate, which tends to craft less of a departure in positions because they need to get to 60 votes and ensure Democratic support. But now that we have this conference committee, the question becomes, how does the House of Representatives thread this needle of some of the calls for lower food stamp benefits without losing those Senate Democrats who are pretty clear that they are going to maintain this aid? And remember, if you just want the food stamp program to continue as is, then don't vote for a farm bill at all, because the farm programs expire, but food stamps keeps chugging along.
And what is the work requirement right now for food stamps, and what is the conference committee arguing about?
This starts getting really technical and really into the weeds and maybe far afield from our topic. But to give sort of the shorthand, there are work requirement rules under the food stamp program where you have to be seeking work or gaining work. You have to. This has to be happening like within 3 months. Certain populations are treated differently in terms of whether you have children, how old you are. The House Republican version of the Farm Bill basically tightens some of those requirements in terms of what you should be seeking for work or job training or such. The family requirements get a little more strict. The age in which these rules apply to you gets expanded a bit, and some of the money for job training is taken out of benefits. It's a small proportion of the benefits, but indeed there is a bit of a diversion. The idea is that there are 6.6 million unfilled jobs in this country. Our problem at this moment isn't that people can't find work. It's just that there's more work than we have people who can find them. So let's get folks into the workforce. But again, the Democratic retort to that is, it just ain't that easy if you're a struggling person. And a lot of people who, under these new rules, would be either completely cut off from benefits or put into some job training program that may or may not work, are actually people who just need the support. And you are taking away support for the reason of your ideology, which has not been proven to be successful in the past.
And I know that there was a new USDA report that came out this week on food insecurity. So why don't we just finish out this side of the conversation by talking about that report?
Well, hey, food insecurity, that's the number of people who struggled to get food in the past year. It's at its lowest since 2007. I mean, the improving economy does have some sort of an impact. It's been falling steadily since the Great Recession. And is now, it's interesting because the number of people who are food insecure is almost the same as the number of people who are getting food stamps. And there is no question that the social safety net and the food aid provided through the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Farm Bill mitigate hunger in the U.S. But you see a big debate now as far as what the design of this program should be going forward. And it's that debate that is really making passing a final Farm Bill problematic. And a week ago, if you had asked me, can they get this done by September 30th, I would have said, yeah, sure, because they can do this and this and this, and it'll go through like this. And now I'm just not so sure, because it's clear that things there are holdups that the principals in the negotiations were kind of hoping wouldn't happen.
And the USDA also does state-by-state figures, and maybe even county by county, on food insecurity. And I know that we've got a graphic on there. And what's your takeaway from this graphic, Alan?
Well, so
where this is the percentage of households that are food insecure or hungry.
Yeah, I mean, it tends to be stronger and weaker in the same parts of the country. The Deep South has always had some of the highest issues with poverty and incidences. And really, a lot of this becomes a proxy for poverty in the United States. You see states, frankly, with stronger social safety net programs having less hunger. And this does not take rocket science to figure out why that is. If you aid poor people have more money and they can get food and they are not hungry. We can get into big debates as far as what your incentives and what your motivations are, or whether that money is spent as efficiently or as well as it could be. But, at a very basic level, if you have a social safety net, if you have programs that give people, education and jobs and opportunities, and the economy is doing better, they're more likely to be able to find something to eat.
So back to the Farm Bill. In addition to the controversy on food stamps, what are the other issues that could hang up the Farm Bill?
Oh, there's a bunch, I mean, food stamps are by far the biggest thing, but you have some issues with conservation programs. There's a lot of consolidation in conservation that folks wonder if they're going to be tailored to the most efficient uses. The research budget always becomes a big issue, and you're seeing sort of a side issue right now where the USDA is saying they're going to relocate a bunch of their economists out of Washington, D.C., which is raising some questions as far as how much the USDA is committed to scientific and economic research. So those become issues. There are some issues in the forestry title as far as funding for wildfires, et cetera. Wildfires tends to eat up the entire Forest Service budget. The Forest Service would like to do some other things too. The crop subsidy programs, the design, the basic structure of them has been accepted pretty widely in agriculture country, so a lot of that is tweaking. But there are some concerns that the balance between sort of the two main farm subsidy programs, one is called the Price Loss Coverage Program, the other one is Average Revenue, It's more of an insurance program. There's always questions as far as the calibration of that, because certain crops do better with one program versus the other, and a lot of this comes down to how you think the farm economy is going to play out over the last 5 years, and which commodity benefits more or less under these programs. And you basically end up with a lot of dueling economists and a lot of people fighting for their regional interests. Just one side note, one of the things that makes the Farm Bill so interesting from an agricultural standpoint is that a lot of your battles still tend to be crop versus crop, commodity versus commodity, rather than Democrat versus Republican. The Farm Bill seems more partisan because it's getting hung up on food stamps, which is a very partisan issue. But when you start looking at the crop programs, maybe that congressman from Georgia would have been a Democrat 50 years ago, and now they're a Republican, but they still grow cotton, and cotton knows no party.
Right.
So you're going to stand up for for the interests of cotton if that's your district, regardless. That is not as fail-safe the case as it once was, but it still holds pretty strong, and it's one of the things that makes agricultural products distinct and fascinating to cover.
So if you're a reporter out there trying to cover sort of the end game of the Farm Bill, what resources or where would you point them to? Beyond the USDA.
Sure. Yeah. So the University of Illinois has a project called Farm Docs, Farm Docs.
DOCS.
Yeah. And that's a real compendium of policy papers and economic studies, of course, focused very much on sort of the Midwest heartland states, which is useful, because when you take a look at iconic farm country and the types of stories that people are looking at, that tends to be an area where they go. They're also related to that is a guy named Keith Good, who does farmpolicy.com, does a lot of retweeting and a lot of following up on agriculture stories. Of course, if you take a look at Politico and Morning Agriculture, a lot of the digest that they do of what's going on in farm policy, I think they have the largest staff covering farm issues of a non-farm publication in Washington, D.C. And I'm very careful when I say that, because I would not want to slight my friends at AgriPulse, who do very wide coverage of pretty much everything agriculture and specializing in agriculture in Washington, D.C. And if I don't mention Bloomberg and Bloomberg government's coverage, I'll get in trouble when I'm done with this podcast. So I certainly want people to look at Bloomberg government as well. The USDA has been putting out a lot of papers, a lot of research, taking a look at different areas of agriculture. A lot of the issues, though, that I would actually encourage reporters to look at, because farm policy is so geared toward the major commodity crops, the corn soy complex and wheat and things that can be traded and such. I think a lot of stories get missed in things like almonds, which is an incredibly important part of the California economy. And California is the #1 agricultural state. You don't think of it that way because its crop mix is sort of a world unto itself.
Right.
But especially the foods that people eat, the foods that get sort of that mass market interest, because people are wondering, what's the guacamole going to cost at their Super Bowl party? You need to be looking at those particular issues at there. And University of California, UC Davis, has a lot of great resources taking a look at that. And so the California Department of Agriculture actually can give you a lot of insights into stories that, if you're looking in sort of the traditional USDA farm organization paths, you might not catch so much.
Great. Those are very helpful. So let's talk about the midterm elections. How do you see things playing out? And I know we've got Charlie Cook's CD ratings. I don't know if you want to talk more generally and then get into.
Yeah, let's take a look at this. Yeah, we can take of course, some of those lists are so long they don't really even come up on the page. But
right.
I think people keep talking about, is there going to be a blue wave? Farmers are going to have a big say as to whether there is a blue wave or not, because you talk about these suburban districts and college-educated folks moving toward the Democrats, and the Hillary Clinton districts that can go move on all of that. Okay, that's great. If you're the Democrats and you're going to have any hope of heading toward the House, having control of the House of Representatives, you've got to lock those down. But if you are going to have a large or potentially lasting majority in the House of Representatives, you have to win in rural America. It's just the way that the maps are drawn. And if you are going to do that, then you have to start looking into some of these districts that are not so urban-based, but you can have an appealing candidate. You know, we saw that with Connor Lamb in the special election in Pennsylvania last winter. It's different candidates in different races. And some of these districts, if we look at the Republican toss-up list, you know, you see districts in Illinois and in California, the Kansas districts. If we went further down the alphabet, you'll see some of those as well. You know, these are folks with large rural constituencies and important farm constituencies as well. 3 races that I have been looking at specifically, we can scroll up again, okay? And these are all in the Republican toss-ups. You know, California 10, Jeff Denham's district, is an interesting one because that's the heart of the Central Valley. And if the Democrats are going to have a hope of ever being a true majority party in the House of Representatives, they have to own districts like this one, where you have a large Hispanic community, an economy that is in transition, where some economic messages can be powerful, and you can build a coalition there. But you do have a farm constituency. It's a very strong agricultural district. This is a district that Gary Condit represented, that Dennis Cardoza represented. It was Democratic until 2010. Jeff Denham has always been very vulnerable in this district, but he has a competitor, Josh Harder, who is, you know, he's young, has Silicon Valley on his credentials, but he's from the district and grew up there. You know, a guy like Josh Harder has got to win a district like that for the Democrats to have a hope for a majority. Another district that I'm looking at is Kansas 2. That's an open seat. I worked for the Wichita Eagle for 7 years, so I just kind of follow Kansas politics as a personal labor of love. You know, you see that has a lean of R+10. It just got moved into toss-up, though, because here the case, the Democrats have a pretty strong candidate. His name is Paul Davis. He ran against Sam Brownback for governor in 2016 and lost the governor's race, but carried the 2nd district. So you have in that area farmers and Republicans who have voted for him in the past and now may have a shot at voting for him this time. In that particular race, you know, Davis has a different agricultural message than, say, a Josh Harder would. You know, Josh Harder is very concerned about immigration because immigration is such a big issue in the Central Valley. In Kansas, it's all about the trade war. It's one of the top soybean producing districts in the country. Also, of course, strong wheat producers. I mean, the farmers are going to be getting aid in this trade mitigation program, but they're very concerned about the loss of markets. And if you listen to Paul Davis talk about agriculture, he doesn't sound that much different from Senator Pat Roberts, the Republican who's the head of the Senate Agriculture Committee. You know, and so there's another district where farmers become important. Another district that I would just put out for a certain amount of contrast is New York 19. That's John Fasso's district. He's being challenged by Antonio Delgado. Now, Antonio Delgado is African-American, recorded a rap album in 2006, also a Rhodes Scholar, but you can just see where we're going now with the dog whistles and some of the campaign ads dealing with this guy. Not somebody who comes off as someone who has spent a lot of time on dairy farms. But this is a big dairy district. And if you talk to Delgado, you know, his message is very much about value-added agriculture because you're in an area where property values are going up and some of that smaller scale niche farming has to be encouraged for farmers to make a living. And he's also talking a lot about the concerns about dairy policy and some of the issues you've had with milk oversupply going on over there. I bring up these 3 districts. They're not necessarily the 3 toughest districts in the country, but they are, I think, very representative of the types of challenges that Democrats need if they are going to have a majority in the House of Representatives, which is they have to be able to talk to farmers. Again, because agriculture has so much variety across the country, they need to have different messages and go in different ways to get these folks to vote for him. And the districts, of course, are all different, too. You know, Kansas, too, has a college town. So the folks in Lawrence, there's a base for a Democrat. You know, the 19th District of New York does go into the New York City suburbs. So that's going to be a big part of their turnout. But there are 3 districts where farmers cannot be ignored and could potentially be a margin. Again, if they go from 70% Trump support to 50% Trump support, that becomes a margin. And those are the sorts of decisions that are going to decide not just whether the Democrats take the House, but whether they have any sort of a working majority. Those are where you look for the blue wave. Now, it's not that Republicans don't have opportunities. I just want to go back on one other thing, and if you could bring that up one more time. Go over to the toss-up Democrat. Okay, there's only two. But I'm a Minnesota native, so I have to
Right.
bring these up. Minnesota 1 and Minnesota 8. The Minnesota 1, that's corn, soybean country. That's basically Iowa North. The Democrat who has been representing them, Tim Walz, is now the DFL, Democratic Farmer Labor Party, for people who aren't as versed in Minnesota politics. He's running for governor. And so this is considered a possible Republican pickup opportunity. Minnesota 8 is, the old Iron Range. A lot of timber and mining, actually, and not so much agriculture, but clearly, an area. That's also an open seat. The Republicans have a very strong candidate in that particular district. And for the Democrats there, it's a question, I think, of knowing whether they have the infrastructure as a party, because in so many rural districts, the infrastructure has decayed. And the sort of message for rural areas that can convince more conservative Republican-leaning voters that they should keep these seats in the Democratic path given the trends that we're seeing nationwide. And so those are two other seats that I think are very important to watch.
Great. And what resources do you suggest for reporters wanting to look deeper into ag issues in some of these toss-up districts?
I would. My dad gets this publication, the North Dakota Farm and Ranch Guide. And I can't tell you all to go out and get the North Dakota Farm and Ranch Guide, because for a lot of people it isn't relevant, but it is illustrative. There is an agricultural press in this country, and it's the weekly farm paper, and people still buy ads for their tractors, and the seed salesmen, they put on their ads there. I would look up whatever the ag press is saying in that local area, because it's a tip sheet. They will tell you about how people are feeling about commodity prices in this particular area. They are looking outside the Beltway with an outside the Beltway perspective. And people there are very friendly as far as sharing information and such. I mean, I have long been a member of the North American Agricultural Journalists, and when they do their annual conference, everyone comes up there, and for me it's great because I spend more time in the Beltway than I would like to, and it is a wonderful way to stay in touch with people who aren't in the Beltway. I mean, look, there are a lot of Twitter feeds and a lot of blogs and a lot of people looking at various things, but I am old-fashioned in that I would say go to the people who have been on the ground covering this for a long time. They have websites, they have contact information. Pick their brains, because and a lot of times they're not really going to be your competitor, and they would be more than happy to see some of these issues that larger non-agricultural publications seemingly ignore, would like to see it get some of the light of day. And if I could just add one other note, I know our time is starting to run short. I think that there is a responsibility to do this that we saw in the 2016 election when so many media organizations were taken by surprise. It's important to note that farm does not equal rural. Rural voters, people who voted for Donald Trump, there's a Rust Belt rural and there's a Farm Belt rural. And things like, tariffs with China and protectionism on autos and aluminum and steel play very differently in a rural Pennsylvania or Ohio than they do a rural Kansas. There are, again, these different points of emphases, but part of the reason I think that national media was taken by surprise in 2016 is that there weren't the resources or attention that were paid to these areas. Now,
I think it was more attention as opposed to resources, right? I mean, they were.
Well, no, I wouldn't say that, because I think that you've seen a trend, and there have been studies showing this, that media concentration is getting more and more set to a few cities. And as you've seen the local newspaper lose resources, they don't have as strong of a voice as they once had. And I think because of the nationalization of media and stories, you weren't catching some of the flavors that you might have in earlier election cycles. Now, you've seen an attempt at a corrective like this, right? The papers on the coast will send people to the heartland with a lot of stories, frankly, that read about life among the savages. And having a lot of savages in my family tree, I can tell you that the attention from the press is often seen as a mixed thing. But to go beyond those efforts, the local media that's still out there, the people who are covering this stuff on the ground, the larger, more coastal-based press, I think, can really be an amplifier of some of these stories that get lost or not so discovered or are more nuanced than they may seem if you are actually getting on the ground and using those resources that are just sort of waiting for someone to call and say, oh, you care about this, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Great. Any other final thoughts?
I'd like to elaborate just a little bit more on this one thing, is to note that farm and rural are not the same.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that underscores some of the difficulty with the president's policies. The president, look, if you are a New York, New Jersey global real estate developer, you would have no reason to think much about farmers before 2016 or 17. And a lot of political appeals to agriculture on the presidential level has tended to be wearing a checked shirt in front of a tractor before the Iowa caucuses and saying you like ethanol, and then you go away. Farm and agricultural issues, because it's wrapped up in the Rural America vote, is getting a salience that it has not had in some time. And you wouldn't see Donald Trump tweeting so much about farmers if there wasn't some concern that these folks might not be in his back pocket. Mm-hmm. This is reassurance. This is messaging. This is also opportunity, both for journalists who are trying to cover rural issues and for people who simply care about rural issues in rural America. You have a spotlight. You have an opportunity to inform and educate on issues and catch some of the nuances, not just of agriculture, but agriculture in the context of the rural and national economy. These are incredibly important issues that need to be covered well and with a level of sophistication that I don't think has been appreciated until the last couple of years. So there are a variety of resources. There are a lot of voices out there. There are a lot of distinctions to be made regionally, demographically. I think it's a very rich field. Now I'm saying a rich field. Another danger of agricultural coverage is so much of the English language is based on farm metaphors that you end up making bad puns constantly.
Right.
But there is so much.
It's great terrain.
It's great terrain. It's such a wonderful field to be cultivated. You can reap a harvest of bountiful stories.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you for that Uber point, Alan. Very much appreciated. So our thanks again to Alan Bjerga, ag reporter for Bloomberg News. Resources from this webinar will be posted for your use on NPF's website at nationalpress.org, where we make good journalists better.